Lesson 19 starts out with the ablative absolute, which is a very complicated concept that you have to practice in order to understand, I think. I'll make this lesson pretty brief rather than kill you with the details, but then I think the main thing that you're going to have to do is do the exercises in the book so that you actually understand how to do the ablative absolute. Again, you're never going to have to write letters to somebody in Latin, so you're not going to have to understand how to use the ablative absolute, but you do have to know how to translate it. The ablative absolute is a type of clause that sets the conditions, circumstances, or settings for another clause. Again, that may not make that much sense when you're hearing it without an example, but think about those words: the conditions, the circumstances, or the setting for another clause. So you've got an ablative absolute clause that'll often be followed by a comma, and then you'll have what's going to be called the main clause. The ablative absolute clause will be followed by the main clause. And the ablative absolute clause will describe the setting or the time, let's say, of the main clause, or it'll describe the circumstances of the main clause, or the conditions under which the main clause took place. Again, that may not make much sense out of context, but you'll see how it works in examples. Most basically, in its most simplest form, the ablative absolute clause consists of a noun and a participle. It's called the ablative absolute because both of those have to be in the ablative case. I'm kind of drawing all over myself here because I don't have a stylus. I'm on the road this week. Both of those have to be in the ablative case. Usually the participle that is used is the fourth principal part, the one that you've learned already, which is also called the participle perfect passive. There are other participles in the Latin language, a total of 4 participles. The one that is most commonly used, if you want to read the good authors like Julius Caesar, or Ovid, or Virgil, the classical authors like Cicero, the reason that Latin has survived for 2,000 years, these guys use the ablative absolute a lot. Usually the participle that they use is the participle perfect passive, which you know as the fourth principal part for all your verbs. It's usually best to try to translate the ablative absolute clause starting with a word like when, because, although, since, and most awkwardly the word with. Now, with is also one of the words that I gave you as a standby for the ablative in general, so you can always go with. It's just the most awkward of them. It's the least English-like. The ablative absolute in general is not very English-like, so you'll have to, again, improvise and add to your translation. At this point, you're going to have to learn to not translate so literally. I want you to always maintain a lot of literalness so you can prove to me that you understand what you're doing, but you also at this point have to be free enough that you can step away from 100% literal translation. Let me show you some examples so it makes it easier. So here are some very simple examples of the ablative absolute. Illo viro duce nihil timeo. So in this example number 1, I've given you the Latin words that you may not know. Ducus is leader, timeo, timera, timui, timitus, timitus, timata, timitum is fear. And it says here, illo viro duce. That is a phrase in the ablative absolute. It has the noun, duce. It has the participle, the fourth principal part, duce. And it has the noun, viro. In its most basic use, the ablative absolute only has to have these 2 parts. Now in this case, it also has illo, which you've learned in this course. That's the demonstrative pronoun. You don't have to have a demonstrative pronoun, but you'll note that each one of these words in the ablative absolute in the red box are all in the ablative case. The noun is in the ablative case, the demonstrative pronoun illo is in the ablative case, and the participle perfect passive is in the ablative case. I've suggested that the best way to translate these strange ablative clauses are with words like when, because, although, since, or arguably with the word with. So look at the example here. Ilo viro duce means with that man leader, if you want to put it in really simple English, with that man leader, I fear nothing. Nihil timeo. Timeo is I fear, nihil is nothing. With that man leader, I fear nothing. Not a very good English translation. It sounds a little bit awkward to my ear. You could say perhaps, with that man having become leader, I fear nothing. Having become leader is the translation for the word duce. That whole participle, that fourth principal part, could easily be translated having become duce, having become leader, being made leader, something like that. Now, maybe a less literal but more Englishy sentence would be when that man, then you'd have to add the word was, leader, I fear nothing. Because that man was leader, I fear nothing. Or is leader, I fear nothing. Although that man is the leader, I fear nothing. Since that man is the leader, I fear nothing. The point is you've got to experiment with the ablative absolute. Try when, try because, try although, try since. And then you've got to manipulate this very compressed phrase, all in the ablative, into setting the setting for the rest of the sentence, into setting up the conditions or the circumstances. With the circumstances being that man is leader, with the conditions being Caesar was leader, under the circumstances that Caesar was leader, I fear nothing. That whole ablative phrase just sets up the condition or circumstances for the rest of the sentence. Let's look at another example. All right, here's a second example. Stellas claris serve fugaurunt. Stella is star, claris is clear, and fugo means flee. So you could try the word when for your ablative absolute clause. I'm going to make it simple. I'm going to put the ablative absolute clauses at the very beginning, which is where they most often are. They don't have to be in the very beginning, but they most often are in the very beginning. Stellas claris is your ablative absolute phrase, right here in the beginning of the sentence. Stellas claris. That sets up the circumstances or the conditions for the main clause, which is the servants fled. You see, the servants fled, that's essential to the meaning of that sentence. Stellas claris is just the context. It's just the color book. It's just making some situation more clear to you. So what you could try out is when the stars were clear, stellas claris, you have a participle claris, the fourth principal part, the participle perfect passive, as it most often is, and you have a noun. That's your most basic ablative absolute. It doesn't have to be that simple, but often it is. Stellas claris, with the stars being clear, the servants fled. The main clause just says the servants fled. The ablative absolute says something like because the stars were clear, or although the stars were clear, or since the stars were clear, or because the stars were clear. Any of those options work. It's all up to your ear to determine what sounds the best. It's up to you to determine how to translate these sentences. You can be as free and as creative as you like within reason, because I've given you certain parameters like the words when, since, although, and because, or possibly with. Here's a third example, so I don't belabor this point so much. I think you'll get more out of doing the exercises than you will out of seeing me do 100 examples, but I want to give you enough examples so you feel that you have some kind of footing and grounding. Caesare interfecto, there's your ablative absolute, does not have to be the first thing in the sentence, but it often is. It consists of a participle perfect passive, or any participle, and it consists of a noun. It could be more complicated than that. As you saw in the first example, there was also the demonstrative pronoun. But in this case, you just have two words. They consist of Caesare interfecto, a participle perfect passive, and the noun. And it says, because Caesar was killed, or with Caesar being killed, Then the second sentence just says, or the rest of the sentence says, nihil timeo, I fear nothing. With Caesar being killed, I fear nothing. Since Caesar was killed, I fear nothing. Although Caesar was killed, I fear nothing. Whichever one makes more sense. Although obviously adds a different kind of context than because. But either one could be right. That's why the work of a translator is creative to a certain extent. You can't tell me for sure whether caesare interfecto means although Caesar was killed, or whether it means because. Either one is valid, or you could mean when Caesar was killed, I fear nothing. All of those are potentially valid. One of them is going to sound best and make sense. Just review these for 1 second right here, these last two. Again, Stellus Claris, that's your ablative absolute, but the stars being clear, the servants fled. Or because the stars were clear, the servants fled. Or again, caesare interfecto, because Caesar was killed, I fear nothing. Whichever one sounds best to your ear, that's how you translate it. And two different people could translate it two different ways. I could never mark it wrong because the ablative absolute involves your opinion. And you can always go with the standby with. To me, it generally sounds the most awkward, but it may be the most sensible to you. The ablative absolute is the most important term or skill or kind of phrase that you need to learn in this chapter. The book gives you some slightly irregular principal parts on page 162. There's no reason for me to go over them. There's no pattern that you can memorize or master. And there's simply no way to predict principal parts. That's why you have to memorize them. The same is true if you were learning German. The same is true if you were learning English. The same is true if you're learning ancient Greek. There are principal parts of verbs that you have to learn because they're simply unpredictable. The list on page 62 are common verbs that do not have completely regular patterns. Sometimes, for example, she points out, the fourth principal part ends with TT or SS. It's not easily predictable, so you have to memorize. Then the book gets into the fifth declension. Similarly, the fifth declension has to be memorized. I don't know how to predict these for you. Here's a masculine example, here's a feminine example. There are no neuter examples, which is helpful. That makes it easy in some ways. There's no great distinction between the masculine and feminine varieties. There is certainly no distinction that I will draw for you, and there's no distinction that the book points out. Their endings are the same, although they may not look exactly the same because you haven't learned yet to recognize the stem itself. But if you look closely enough, you can see the pattern of the endings. It's not like any of the other declensions that you've learned so far, but it's not that different either. For example, the M is the sign of the accusative. You have the ES as the sign of the accusative plural and as the sign of the nominative plural. You have RUM in the genitive plural for both the masculine and the feminine forms. You have BUS, although it's not IBUS, ibis, it is BUS as the ending for the dative and the ablative. Once you learn to see the fact that there are patterns that do repeat, even if they're not that easily recognizable at first, it'll make it so much easier to memorize. There are patterns within patterns, even for these things that are seemingly irregular and brand new. At any rate, this is the fifth declension, your final noun declension. You don't have to learn any more after this. These obviously, though, these two paradigms, DAs, which means day, and res, which means thing, or stuff, or affair, or business. It's a very generalized word. The res publica is the public thing, or the republic. Res means things, stuff, deeds, affairs, business. It means things in the most broad sense of English as well. The endings are pretty easy based on the patterns that you've already learned for the first, second, third, and fourth declensions, but they're not entirely regular. you can see obviously that you follow the same pattern as you always do. You take the genitive and you drop the ending, which in this case is I. Once you drop off the I, you can see what the base is, or the theme is, the stem, and then you can determine what you add. You add an I for the genitive, an I for the dative, you add an EM for the accusative, you add an E for the ablative, and so forth and so on. So basically, if you memorize these two models, DAs and RAs, you'll be able to do all of the fifth declension nouns that you encounter. Just as important, arguably more important and more difficult, is the fact that there is another kind of adjective. So far, all the adjectives you've learned have been 2 and 2 adjectives that look like this: bonas, bona, bonam. That's a pretty easy pattern. You've seen it 100 times before. That's what the fourth principal part looks like. It's not too tricky. Sorry for all the strange movement making you seasick. That pattern is very familiar to you now, the bonas, bona, bonam pattern. Now you have to learn a new pattern for adjectives. This is really the last major pattern. There are some varieties of third declension adjectives, or what I call 3-3-3 adjectives. 3-3-3 because each of these forms is the third declension, as opposed to 2-1-2 adjectives, which is a second declension masculine, a first declension feminine, and a second declension neuter. It follows the same masculine and feminine pattern: third declension masculine, third declension feminine, third declension neuter. But the endings are obviously different from bonas, bona, bonam. Note that the masculine and feminine forms are exactly the same. I'll scroll up there for you to see all of them. The masculine and feminine forms have no variations whatsoever. It may be surprising to you, based on your knowledge of third declension so far, that this has an I, and this has an I, and this has an I. That makes it an I stem. This has an I, this has an I, and the ablative singulars all have an I. This is what distinguishes adjectives of the 3-3-3 variety from your regular old noun of the third declension variety. If you go back to rex regis as your paradigmatic third declension, rex, regis, regi, regum, and rega, you'll note, for example, that the ablative here is an E, whereas the ablative here is an I. If you look at the genitive plural of reges, it is regum. That's a normal third declension noun, whereas omnium has an I in the ending. Same thing for your regular third declension neuters. They would have an A as the ending rather than an IA. So this makes third declension adjectives different from your normal third declension nouns. Third declension adjectives have an I. Regular third declension nouns do not have the I right here, the I right here, or the I here and here. I'm going to show you that again with a clean slate. This has an I here instead of an E, which is what your regular third declension noun. Your regular third declension noun would not have an I. And it has an I before the UM right here. That is not what happens with a regular third declension noun. This is a third declension adjective, a 3-3-3 adjective. And it does not have an I here. Your regular third declension noun does not do what your third declension adjectives following this pattern do. So again, it's pretty easy if you've already mastered the third declension noun pattern of rex regis. But at the same time, you've got to memorize this new pattern for the adjectives. A lot of memorization in Latin for the first year. Many of you really are only required to take 2 semesters, so you don't want to get beyond the first year. So it may seem daunting and overwhelming to do all this memorization, but anyone who would want to continue after this would need this foundation in order to do anything like read real Latin, to read the classics. To get something out of the literature, you'd have to be able to read. To read, you have to memorize these elementary patterns. For the person that's seeing this for the first time, I understand that's overwhelming. I learned Latin myself at one point. It was very daunting, and I didn't understand everything the first time around. So be patient, and please ask me questions. So although the concepts are fairly difficult this week, there is a great deal of material. And I want to give you a short quiz this week to complement the one from last week, because there's so much material in the last 3 weeks total that I feel it's too much just to put on one quiz. I feel it'd be overwhelming to do it all at once. And then what you need really to have is a kind of midterm, even though it's an abbreviated summer course, that consolidates all this information. Even though it's nearing the end, I want to spread it out and give you that next week so that you have time to absorb all this material. It's just too much to do all at once on one quiz. You've got the exercise in the textbook, the translation, and these screencasts to watch. So I want you to absorb it slowly and practice it week by week, not be overwhelmed so that you can't understand any of it. Please Skype me if you don't understand these points. And I'll post a short quiz that will go along with this podcast and the week before so that you can consolidate all that information.